Hey guys, this evening I will commence with the steadfast truths concerning the Middle Ages. You are familiar with them, the ones you hear echoed at social gatherings, in television programs, and within high school history lessons, which are, in fact, utterly mistaken. So, before you settle in, I invite you to take a brief moment to show your appreciation for the video and subscribe, but I only ask this if you truly find value in my work here. And please let me know in the comments from where you are watching and the current time on your end. It is perpetually intriguing to see the global audience that joins me. Now, lower the illumination, perhaps activate a fan for that gentle ambient noise. And let us gradually begin this evening's exploration together. Among the most persistent misconceptions about the Middle Ages is the notion that people believed the earth was as level as a platter, and that if one sailed sufficiently far, one would tumble into the void like some medieval rodent. The image is certainly compelling, anxious mariners glancing over the vessel's rail, contemplating whether they might encounter dragons or simply an exceptionally long descent. Regrettably, for that vivid mental image, scholars of the medieval period were already aware of the Earth's spherical nature. In truth, this knowledge had been established for centuries. The ancient Greeks had calculated its dimensions using simple tools like sticks, shadows, and arithmetic, which is the historical parallel to securing a Nobel Prize with a measuring stick and a little sunlight. Eratosthenes accomplished this in the 3rd century BCE, and his technique was still being taught during the Middle Ages. Therefore, no, the typical monk was not kept awake at night by a fear of cosmic precipices. The myth of a flat Earth actually gained traction due to 19th century authors who aimed to portray the medieval era as a prolonged charade of unenlightenment. Washington Irving's biography of Columbus depicted the navigator as courageously challenging all the flat Earth proponents of his time. In actuality, the true debate in Columbus's era was not, is it round, but rather, how large is it? Columbus believed it was significantly smaller than its actual size. This was an error that, without the Americas conveniently situated in his path, would have resulted in his crew starving to death somewhere in the vastness of the Pacific. Even ordinary seamen were aware of the Earth's curvature. They observed how a ship's masts would vanish over the horizon before its hull did. One does not require a doctorate to perceive this unless one is making a concerted effort to overlook it. Medieval art even depicted globes held in Christ's hand, and monarchs posed with them as if they had personally discovered geography. This is not an action one would take if one was convinced he was governing the world's largest throwing disc. Ah, indeed, the quintessential mental portrayal. Every individual in the medieval period was an unclean, vermin-infested being who regarded water with the same apprehension as sorcery. Supposedly, they traversed the streets exuding an odor reminiscent of damp livestock and despair. This is a gratifying stereotype, but much like the flat Earth fallacy, it is incorrect. In truth, medieval Europeans engaged in bathing much more frequently than they are given credit for. Communal bathing facilities were prevalent in towns, frequently serving as centers of social activity where individuals could exchange gossip, finalize business arrangements, and in certain instances partake in supplementary amenities for an additional charge. Let me just state that some bathhouses were the medieval counterpart to a full-service spa and leave the matter there. Even in provincial areas, washing was not an infrequent practice. Rivers, lakes, and barrels situated in courtyards all fulfilled this function. Soap was available, produced from animal fats and lye. And while it was not precisely a lavender-infused artisanal indulgence, it effectively served its purpose. Monks adhered to rigorous washing protocols, and royalty occasionally possessed private bathing chambers equipped with heated water. The medieval upper class did not simply idle about, stewing in their own filth. They commissioned ornate, scented baths, often infused with herbs such as rosemary, sage, and mint. Essentially, they were practicing a form of medieval aromatherapy long before it became an overpriced commodity in contemporary wellness establishments. So, what is the origin of this myth? Direct your blame toward subsequent centuries. During the Renaissance, and particularly following the 16th century, medical doctrine evolved to posit that bathing expanded the pores, allowing harmful air to enter. Thus, paradoxically, people in later periods bathed less than their medieval forerunners. This implies that your typical 14th century baker was likely cleaner than a 17th century French courtier, although he probably smelled more of bread than of costly perfume. Naturally, bathing did not invariably entail a full-body cleansing. At times, it consisted merely of washing the face, hands, and any other parts socially required to prevent scandal. But the notion that they shunned water entirely is simply a lazy form of historical defamation. Even commoners utilized rainwater, which was complimentary, pure, and descended directly upon their heads, whether they desired it or not. The concept that medieval people were universally short is one of history's most indolent fictions. Were this accurate, jousting competitions would have resembled irate toddlers attempting to dislodge one another from rocking horses. The reality? The majority of medieval men had an average height of approximately 170 centimeters, while women were around 160 centimeters. They were not giants, but they were certainly not diminutive enough to take refuge in a wine cask, though some might have considered it during periods of taxation. Archaeologists have excavated a sufficient number of skeletons to verify that the Middle Ages yielded numerous tall individuals, particularly within the more well-nourished social strata. Knights were not exactly required to stoop when passing through doorways, but neither were they striking their helmets against the lintels. A portion of this misunderstanding stems from medieval architecture. Low doorways were not constructed for small people. They were constructed for minimal heat dissipation. Medieval craftsmen had a superior grasp of insulation than they did of hygiene. And if this resulted in you striking your forehead each time you accessed the pantry, so be it. Beds were also shorter, but this was due to people frequently sleeping in a semi-upright posture, which they believed would stop vapors from causing suffocation. Of course, had you been inhaling medieval air, you would have been concerned about vapors as well. The aristocracy, with diets abundant in meat, dairy, and exotic imports, frequently possessed a height advantage over the peasantry, who subsisted primarily on bread and cabbage. Chroniclers, keen to gratify their benefactors, exaggerated royal statures in their writings. Consequently, in some records, kings appeared as tall as cathedral towers, which is remarkable until one realizes these same scribes also asserted the monarch could slay a boar with a single, severe glance. Yes, inadequate nutrition, illness, and strenuous labor did impede the growth of some individuals, but the comprehensive picture is significantly more diverse than the stereotype of the miniature medieval man implies. There were slender guards, robust stonemasons, and a considerable number of market vendors who could easily knock you down for inquiring about their husband's whereabouts. So, no, the medieval world was not inhabited by a race of human miniatures. They were individuals much like us, but with poorer dental hygiene and a startling endurance for cold air. If I were to trust every high school history book from 50 years prior, the Middle Ages were a 1,000-year hiatus between the Roman Empire and the Renaissance. No artistic expression, no scientific inquiry, no advancement, just commoners working in the mud while clergymen debated about angels on the head of a pin. In truth, medieval Europe was a far cry from an intellectual desert. The era gave rise to universities, Gothic cathedrals, mechanical timepieces, and a greater number of philosophical arguments than a contemporary online discussion board. People did not cease their thinking after the fall of Rome. They simply directed their thoughts to different matters, such as how to prevent one's soup from turning to ice in January, or whether it was ethically permissible to levy interest on a loan. The dark designation originates in part from later Renaissance authors who enjoyed complimenting themselves. By depicting the Middle Ages as a cultural abyss, they could present their own time as a brilliant new beginning. It is a promotional tactic as ancient as history itself. To promote your own offering, you must denigrate the alternative. Regrettably, this negative portrayal has persisted. There is also the matter of illumination. We now view medieval interiors through the dim glow of candlelight during historical reenactments, and our minds interpret this as them having lived in perpetual shadow. In reality, they possessed windows, oil lamps, and torches. But yes, it was still less bright than your typical kitchen illuminated by LEDs. And yet, people still found ways to read, write, and produce manuscripts of such intricacy that they could cause one's eyes to hurt. As for being uninteresting, life in the Middle Ages was anything but. Tournaments involved men in suits of armor striking each other until they lost consciousness for entertainment. Itinerant performers presented acrobatics, music, and comedy, some of which would result in a ban from YouTube today. Markets were loud, disorganized events where one could purchase a chicken, engage a scribe, and have a tooth extracted all on the same thoroughfare. Certainly, there were extended, quiet winters where little occurred besides gossip and the preparation of stew, but this is a characteristic of any period. The distinction is that medieval people could not use television as a distraction. Instead, they devised complex games, narrated stories, and on occasion held a festival so unrestrained that the church was compelled to intervene. At some point, the notion arose that medieval Europeans subsisted on nothing more than boiled cabbage and sorrow. This is partly because contemporary historians tend to concentrate on the diet of the peasantry, which I admit was not a culinary experience worthy of a Michelin star. However, to assert that all medieval cuisine was flavorless is akin to evaluating modern food based on what is available at a gas station. The reality is that medieval kitchens were capable of producing dishes so intensely spiced that one's tongue might have lodged a formal objection. Cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, ginger. These were not uncommon seasonings reserved for special occasions by the wealthy. They were liberally added to meat, fish, and even wine, with the fervor of a youth applying cologne for the first time. Spices were indeed costly, but they served as a mark of status, the medieval counterpart to having a luxury automobile displayed in your banquet hall. And it was not merely about the spices. Chefs in aristocratic households valued color and presentation. A roasted peacock might be presented with its plumage reattached for a dramatic effect, or a meat pie could conceal live birds that would emerge when it was sliced open, an early version of interactive dining, though likely distressing for the birds. Combinations of sweet and savory were also in vogue. Meat might be prepared with dried fruits and honey, which seems unusual until one considers that many of us have likely consumed pineapple on pizza. Even the common people had methods for making their food more appealing. Ale, onions, herbs like parsley and sage, and cured fish introduced variety to a diet that was otherwise heavily reliant on bread. Of course, sometimes variety simply meant that the bread was moldy but still consumable if you scraped it, but it was not a state of constant deprivation. Seasonal festivals and markets also provided opportunities to sample exotic items like imported almonds, or, if you were exceptionally fortunate, a piece of candied ginger. The true lack of flavor emerged during periods of want, famines, sieges, or winters when the supply of cabbage was exhausted. That is when meals transformed into mere sustenance for survival. But when circumstances were favorable, medieval cuisine could be lively, flavorful, and at times alarmingly innovative. Somewhere, Hollywood determined that a knight in full plate armor was essentially an incapacitated metal container teetering about until someone toppled him over like an unsteady refrigerator. I am sure you have seen the depiction. A knight lands on his back and is unable to rise, remaining there like an upended tortoise, while his adversary courteously stands by to deliver the final blow. Let me provide a reality check. A properly crafted suit of plate armor had a weight of approximately 45 to 60 pounds. This is comparable to carrying a fully loaded hiking rucksack, except that instead of putting a strain on your shoulders, the weight was spread evenly across your entire body. Medieval armorers were not in the practice of creating metallic confines. They were in the practice of preserving your life while you brandished a sword at someone else who was attempting to end yours. Knights were capable of running, jumping, mounting their horses without the aid of cranes, and yes, even performing certain acrobatic maneuvers. There are extant training manuals that depict fully armored combatants grappling, rolling, and wrestling as if they were trying out for a medieval version of the WWE. Attempt to do that in your denim trousers and then tell me who is more constrained. So, where did the myth of the tortoise knight originate? One source is a 15th century style of tournament where participants wore supplementary armor that was heavier, more cumbersome, and designed exclusively for jousting. Yes, this rendered you as nimble as a garden shed, but it was not combat gear. It was athletic equipment, the medieval equivalent of an American football player's protective padding. You would not assess a sprinter's velocity by observing someone in a mascot outfit, would you? Another source is Victorian-era historical reenactments. 19th century medieval armor was frequently ornamental, ill-fitting, or constructed from thicker steel for exhibition rather than for combat. Place a rigid, overweight gentleman into one of those, and naturally he would move like a defective clockwork toy. And then, of course, we have contemporary television programs that believe a slow, clumsy knight provides better physical comedy than a swift, formidable one. To be honest, if knights had been as inept as popular culture portrays them, the Middle Ages would have been quite brief indeed, because no one survives on a battlefield by remaining on the ground like a helpless beetle awaiting assistance. In reality, armor did not render you immobile. It rendered you self-assured, the kind of self-assurance that enables you to enter a sword fight and think, "I am prepared for this," rather than, "I hope my will is current." If I were to believe most films, the medieval Catholic Church operated a special department whose sole function was to incinerate books, scowl at astronomers, and proclaim heretic at anyone possessing a magnifying instrument. It is a striking portrayal, the solemn monk shattering telescopes in slow motion as lightning illuminates the scene outside. Regrettably, the reality was less about inquisition and more about being a source of funds. Yes, there were instances where the Church came into conflict with particular concepts. Galileo would certainly attest to this. But the broad assertion that the medieval Church prohibited scientific inquiry is about as precise as claiming that medieval commoners inhabited mud dwellings throughout the year. Many of the individuals conducting scientific research at that time were members of the clergy. Monks transcribed ancient Greek and Arabic texts, managed astronomical observatories, and conducted medical experiments in between their brewing of beer, which, to be frank, was their most cherished experiment. Medieval universities, where a significant amount of scientific activity occurred, were primarily established and financed by the Church. These were not casual weekend associations. They were organized establishments that produced scholars who engaged in debates on astronomy, mathematics, optics, and anatomy. The narrative of the medieval Dark Ages originates in part from Enlightenment authors who believed that denigrating the Middle Ages enhanced the perception of their own era. Spoiler alert, self-satisfied promotional efforts are not a recent phenomenon. The Church did not harbor an aversion to science. It simply preferred that it conform to certain philosophical and theological parameters. If you wished to assert that the earth was spherical, there was no issue. Scholars had been aware of this since ancient times. If you wished to assert that the earth was not the center of the universe, well, at that point, you were challenging the cosmic order, and that could lead to uncomfortable situations at social gatherings in Rome. It is also important to recognize that a significant portion of Europe's scientific heritage endured precisely because church institutions safeguarded it. Without those diligent monks in unheated scriptoria, half of Aristotle's writings might have been consumed by rodents and decay. And without the Church's need to determine the date of Easter, medieval Europe might have fallen centuries behind in the field of astronomy. You have likely encountered it in some poorly researched historical meme. In the Middle Ages, the average life expectancy was 30. This conjures the mental image of a medieval peasant marking his 29th birthday as if it were his final celebration. The reality, however, is somewhat less grim and far less amusing for the "they were so backward" contingent. That figure, the notorious 30, represents an average, and averages can be deceptive. Averages include everyone, even infants. And here is the crucial point. Medieval infant mortality rates were alarmingly high. A great number of children did not live past their first 5 years due to illness, starvation, or simply being overly inquisitive near uncovered wells. These premature deaths significantly lowered the average. If you managed to survive childhood, your chances of reaching your 50s or even 60s were quite good, as long as you steered clear of wars, epidemics, and the occasional suspiciously aimed dagger in political arenas. Medieval documents are filled with individuals who lived long enough to grumble about the youth of today in Latin. The notion that everyone simply expired at 30 also overlooks the presence of aged monarchs, bishops, farmers, and craftsmen. Even commoners could and did live to an advanced age. Archaeological findings reveal numerous skeletons with heavily worn teeth, mended fractures, and signs of arthritis, clear indications of people who had been around for many decades. So why do we persist in believing the "everyone died young" myth? Because it makes history appear more compelling, and because stating that the average was 30, but that this is attributable to high child mortality, lacks the same impact at social gatherings. Here is a contemporary parallel. If tomorrow all toddlers were to tragically disappear, a grim thought, I know, but follow my logic, the average age of the population would increase dramatically. Conversely, if 1/3 of all infants died at birth, the average would decrease, even if the surviving adults were still tending their gardens at 75. In essence, medieval people were not biological ephemera. They did not reach the age of 30 and immediately collapse as if in an episode of Game of Thrones. Life was more challenging, medicine was less advanced. But if you survived the perilous lottery of childhood, you had a reasonable opportunity to become the village elder. If I am to believe the movies, every medieval village had a designated day for burning witches, scheduled right after market day and just before the tavern opened. But despite this fiery image, medieval Europe was not, in fact, constantly illuminating the night sky with witch persecutions. In reality, the majority of the large-scale witch burnings occurred after the Middle Ages, during the early modern period. So, technically, if you were to travel back in time to the 1300s with the expectation of getting a prime view of a witch trial, you would likely find yourself either bored or conscripted to mend a damaged wagon wheel. The medieval church itself was surprisingly doubtful about witchcraft in its earlier centuries. The official stance in the 10th and 11th centuries was that most witches were merely confused individuals or the targets of superstitious beliefs. Some church documents even explicitly declared that believing in the supernatural abilities of witches was, in itself, a form of heresy, a delightful turn of events where the witch hunters themselves would be in jeopardy. Of course, there were sporadic prosecutions, but incineration was not the preferred method. Hanging, banishment, or the time-honored practice of public humiliation were more frequent penalties. Fire was a costly resource, and medieval towns were not particularly keen on squandering valuable wood on your neighbor who was known to mutter over her herbs. The true frenzy of witch burning did not begin until the late 15th to 17th centuries, driven by a combination of religious strife, widespread social anxiety, and the printing press, which disseminated the Malleus Maleficarum, essentially a how-to manual for identifying witches, authored by a man who had been spurned by several women and apparently took it quite personally. In the actual medieval period, accusations of sorcery were often more political or personal than they were supernatural. If your sheep disappeared, you would blame the neighbor you disliked. If the crops failed, you would point a finger at the irritable old woman who did not attend church. And if your husband was unfaithful, well, perhaps that young, appealing widow down the lane was casting a spell on him. It is quite convenient, is it not? So, while witch-burning has become a colloquialism for medieval cruelty, it is somewhat like holding the 1990s responsible for TikTok. Wrong era, wrong technology, same moral hysteria. The medieval period had its share of genuine horrors, but constant persecutions of spellcasters was not among them. In other words, medieval witches were more likely to be the subject of gossip than to be set ablaze. The stories of bonfires came later, thanks to a Europe that had superior printing technology, greater paranoia, and far too much idle time. If popular culture is to be believed, medieval peasants were little more than animated figures of mud, without a voice, without power, and simply biding their time until a knight rode over them on his way to a jousting match. The reality is that they possessed more rights than many people realize, just not the kind of rights one would boast about in a personal advertisement. Yes, peasants were situated at the lowest level of the feudal system, but this did not render them legally non-existent. Many were tied to the land as serfs, yet they still had established rights within manorial courts, which were akin to local legal associations, but without the velvet barriers and with a great deal more arguments concerning pigs. These courts enabled peasants to contest financial penalties, resolve disputes, and in some instances even bring legal action against their lord, though achieving victory was somewhat like winning a staring competition with the sun. They also had recourse to traditional rights, the entitlement to collect firewood, to let animals graze on common lands, or to fish in designated rivers. These common resources were essential for their existence and were vigorously protected. Attempt to revoke a peasant's right to gather fallen wood, and you might awaken to find your hay inexplicably ablaze. Taxes and obligations were indeed a hardship, yes, but they were generally foreseeable. Peasants were aware of their debts and could, at times, enter into negotiations, which is more than can be said for your current internet service provider. And while they were obligated to provide labor for their lord, there were constraints. The lord could not simply order you to construct a moat for him because he felt uninspired on a Tuesday. And then there is the misconception that peasants were permanently confined to their villages, forever bound to the same piece of land. In truth, many journeyed to markets, festivals, and even to other towns for temporary employment. The road was not inaccessible to them. It simply demanded time, authorization, and the fortitude to bypass every tavern along the way. So, no, medieval peasants did not exist in a legal vacuum where the lord could act without restraint or repercussion. Their rights may seem insignificant to us, but in their world they were worth protecting, sometimes even to the point of death, or at the very least until the harvest was complete. The no rights myth persists because it is straightforward and dramatic. But actual medieval life was more intricate. Peasants were not merely subjects, they were also participants in the complex interplay of feudal obligations and entitlements. And like in any well-structured game, the rules existed even if the house typically emerged as the victor. If you imagine medieval castles as immense, cold structures of gray stone that dominate a perpetually rain-soaked village, I congratulate you. You have been viewing an excess of documentaries filmed on overcast days in November. In reality, medieval castles could be astonishingly vibrant. And no, I am not referring to the stains left by blood after a military engagement. Castles were frequently coated with plaster and painted in vivid, almost garish hues. Walls might be whitewashed to shimmer in the sunlight, adorned with stripes, or embellished with large-scale paintings. Imagine less of a somber Gothic atmosphere and more of a medieval Instagram filter adjusted to a bright and showy setting. Even stone walls, when left uncovered, were sometimes treated with pigments to impart a warmer appearance. It appears that medieval people had no desire to reside in a grim, shadowy setting from Game of Thrones. They desired a place that appeared formidable, not melancholic. On the inside, things became even more ostentatious. Great halls were adorned with colorful tapestries, not only for aesthetic purposes, but also to block drafts and to conceal any imperfections left by the stonemasons. Heraldic banners, intricately carved wooden ceilings, and painted shields introduced bursts of color throughout. Floors might be covered with elaborately patterned tiles or scattered with fresh rushes. And yes, those rushes could conceal some unmentionable refuse, but at least they were, in principle, replaced on a regular basis. Even the furnishings were painted and gilded. Chairs, chests, and beds were often intricately carved and then embellished in shades of red, blue, and gold. If you were to enter the bedchamber of a medieval nobleman expecting to see gray stone and a minimalist aesthetic, you would likely require sunglasses. So, why do we perceive castles as being so bleak? In part, it is because paint deteriorates and plaster disintegrates, leaving only the bare stone structure. Archaeology can inform us that they were once vibrant, but observing a ruin in its current state is like meeting a famous musician in his 80s and assuming he has always appeared that way. This is not to suggest that castles were entirely warm and inviting. They were, after all, military structures with drafty corridors, irregular staircases, and an aroma that was a mixture of wood smoke and horse. But from a visual standpoint, they were constructed to impress allies, daunt adversaries, and serve as a reminder to the peasantry of who held power. In summary, medieval castles were not gray and devoid of cheer. They were the architectural equivalent of wearing a crown while proclaiming your family's emblem in bold, primary colors. The austerity is merely what remains after the centuries have worn away the medieval coat of paint. The Black Death was, without a doubt, one of the most lethal pandemics in recorded history. It swept through Europe, the Middle East, and portions of Asia in the middle of the 14th century like a plague-themed amusement park ride that no one wished to experience. But the notion that it eliminated half of the world's population is an overstatement, even for an ailment that led medieval physicians to believe that securing live chickens to one's armpits was a sensible medical treatment. In reality, historians project that it killed between 30 and 60% of Europe's populace, which is sufficiently dreadful without inflating the figure to half of the planet. Entire settlements were eradicated. Commercial pathways fell silent, and one could likely purchase a dwelling for the cost of a root vegetable, assuming one could find a living person to conduct the sale. But the remainder of the world was not nearly as affected. China and the Middle East did experience substantial casualties, yes, but Africa, the Americas, and a large part of Oceania were not impacted. In 1347, half of the world was not even aware of Europe's existence, let alone that it was in the midst of a pandemic of apocalyptic proportions. The idea that everyone was affected is more of a theatrical narrative device, much like asserting that every medieval knight was a gallant hero or that every princess had blonde hair. That being said, the psychological toll of the plague on the affected areas was immense. People saw it as a form of divine retribution, as contaminated air, or as a consequence of foreign merchants with questionable goods. Modern germ theory was still centuries in the future. Consequently, medieval preventive measures varied from burning incense to carrying bouquets of flowers to, my personal favorite, refraining from bathing, as they believed it exposed the pores to harmful air. Spoiler alert, refraining from bathing was not effective. The plague also fundamentally altered economies. A scarcity of labor meant that surviving peasants could insist on better wages and working conditions. Some even departed from their manors to find employment elsewhere, whether legally or not. This abrupt change in negotiating power was as unwelcome to the aristocracy as finding a rodent in their soup. If Hollywood has taught us anything, it is that in the Middle Ages, every legal conflict could be resolved by two individuals striking each other with swords until one of them was deceased, ideally during a rainstorm with dramatic musical accompaniment. In reality, trial by combat was more akin to a flamboyant legal technicality that one could theoretically use, but that was rarely put into practice. The concept was straightforward. If you were charged with a crime, you could establish your innocence by engaging in a fight with your accuser. The rationale was that God would side with the innocent, which sounds admirable until one recalls that God's judgment often bore a striking resemblance to the more skilled combatant emerging victorious. And yes, this was applicable even in civil matters. Imagine taking legal action against your neighbor over a purloined cow and finding yourself in a muddy field, trying to avoid having your helmet crushed. But trial by combat was not the medieval equivalent of a modern courtroom drama. In most regions, it was uncommon, strictly controlled, and frequently substituted with other procedures such as sworn statements, witness accounts, or everyone's favorite, trial by ordeal, which entailed activities like handling red-hot pieces of iron or submerging people in rivers. Combat was costly, perilous, and created social discomfort if your adversary happened to be your brother-in-law. When it was employed, the regulations could be peculiar. There were specified weapons, designated fighting areas, and even time constraints. And in contrast to common belief, it was not invariably a fight to the death. At times, the contest concluded when one participant was too wounded to proceed or simply gave up because they concluded that God was likely not on their side after all. One of the most notable later instances was the 1386 duel between Jean de Carouge and Jacques Legris in France, which has been immortalized in The Last Duel. It was a significant event precisely because such trials had become so infrequent by that time. When these trials did occur, they attracted large audiences because, let's be honest, medieval entertainment choices were scarce, and two irate noblemen fighting for divine validation was essentially the Super Bowl. By the late Middle Ages, trial by combat had become a legal anachronism, surviving only as an antiquated oddity. In England, it officially remained a legal option until 1819, when a shrewd defendant actually attempted to invoke it, and legislators promptly recognized that perhaps they should eliminate that choice before anyone else got any ideas. So no, medieval courts were not simply disguised armed confrontations. The majority of conflicts were resolved with documents, not with weapons, which is probably for the best. Most lawyers are not skilled with a sword. If I were to believe the common stereotype, medieval medicine consisted of little more than applying leeches until the patient either ceased their complaints or ceased their breathing, whichever occurred first. And yes, the practice of bloodletting with leeches was indeed a reality, but it was not the sole method. And medieval practitioners of healing did not simply sit by, awaiting their next slimy remedy to take effect. In reality, medicine during the Middle Ages was a diverse combination of inherited classical knowledge, traditional folk treatments, astrology, and the occasional highly dubious experiment. Physicians, apothecaries, midwives, and barber surgeons each had their designated functions. The physicians donned long garments and attempted to make an impression with their use of Latin terminology. Apothecaries provided herbs, powders, and enigmatic concoctions, some beneficial, some merely placebos, and some that probably ought to have been accompanied by a may cause death warning. Barber surgeons, in the meantime, could trim your hair, extract your tooth, and amputate your limb, all within a single visit. A model of efficiency. Leeches were employed as part of a wider belief in the necessity of balancing the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. If you possessed an excess of one, your body was considered to be out of equilibrium. And the remedy might involve draining some blood, causing you to vomit, or administering a purgative potent enough to operate a small grist mill. But medieval medicine was not simply a process of trial and frequent misstep. Herbal remedies such as willow bark for pain relief, garlic for combating infections, and honey for treating wounds did have genuine value and are still utilized in some capacity today. Hospitals, which were managed by religious organizations, offered care, even if that care sometimes consisted of prayers and a sanitary bed. And in Islamic Spain and the Byzantine Empire, medical practices could be surprisingly sophisticated, with comprehensive surgical guides and precise anatomical illustrations, although Europe often chose to adhere to Galen's 1,200-year-old theories instead. Yes, some treatments were absurd. You might have been given a potion concocted from powdered emeralds or advised to wear a deceased mole around your neck as a cure for a cough. But there was a rationale behind the apparent insanity, at least from their perspective, and not every patient was left in a worse condition than when they had arrived. If I were to go by Hollywood, every medieval day commenced with a rooster crowing in my ear, followed by 16 hours of tilling mud until my hands detached, and concluded with either a death from the plague or being incinerated as a witch. The Middle Ages, as I have been told, were essentially a continuous, arduous ordeal, punctuated only by the occasional public execution to raise morale. Now, yes, life was not precisely a luxurious getaway. Famine, warfare, disease, and the sporadic Viking incursion were very tangible issues. But the notion that everyone was perpetually in a state of gloom, gazing at the ground while lamenting, is, well, a very poor historical account. Medieval people experienced laughter, sang songs, shared jokes, and held celebrations whenever possible. Often, these were festivals so boisterous they would make contemporary music festivals seem like quiet Sunday gatherings. Weddings were not rigid formal events. They were multi-day celebrations involving dancing, feasting, and enough wine to make one forget that the groom's family still owed them 3 goats. Even the common folk had time for sports, games, and intricate holiday customs. Because if you are going to exist without Wi-Fi, you might as well become exceptionally skilled at archery. And the food, despite the myth of consuming gruel 3 times daily, consisted of seasonal fruits and vegetables, meats, breads, cheeses, and even imported spices that found their way to many dining tables. Certainly, not everyone was feasting on roasted swan sprinkled with saffron, but they were not subsisting on a diet of despair either. Art, music, and storytelling flourished. People created beautifully embroidered garments, carved elaborate wooden items, and recounted epic sagas, not out of boredom, but because the pursuit of beauty was important. The idea that life was solely about survival is a product of modern-day skepticism, viewed through a distorted lens. And yes, the average lifespan statistic is often used to argue that life was brief and wretched, but that figure is distorted by the high rate of infant mortality. If you survived beyond childhood, you could readily live into your 60s, which is more than sufficient time to form strong opinions about your neighbor's sheep. Medieval life certainly had its hardships, without a doubt, but it also contained joy, humor, music, and love, all the elements that make life meaningful. The only individuals who believe the Middle Ages were nothing but suffering are the same ones who presume that medieval people never bathed. Spoiler alert, they did. Just perhaps not as frequently as you might prefer. On the boundless Mongolian steppe, where the terrain extends so far that the horizon appears to be the world's boundary, the unexpected arrival of a horseman was never a mere chance event. It was an act of destiny. For centuries, the nomadic Mongols held the belief that every visitor was dispatched by Tangri, the eternal blue sky, as a measure of one's honor. And thus, when the dust from hooves began to billow in the distance, the atmosphere within the jir, the felt-clad dwelling, would change in a heartbeat. Hospitality among the Mongols was not a courteous social convention. It was a hallowed duty. The sheer expanse of the steppe was both magnificent and perilous. Days of travel could lie between one encampment and the next, and a night without protection could be fatal. To refuse a traveler warmth, sustenance, and security was to endanger their life and, in the Mongol worldview, to bring misfortune upon oneself. Regardless of whether the guest was a relative, a traveling merchant, or even a former adversary, the principle remained constant. You received them as if they were a long-lost companion. In this manner, hospitality was not merely a matter of survival, it was a matter of integrity. It confirmed a common humanity across the immense void, connecting strangers through nourishment, warmth, and mutual respect. Out here on the wind-battered plains, you could never be certain if the stranger at your entrance might one day be you. One of the most remarkable features of Mongol hospitality was its disregard for past conflicts, a characteristic that perplexed foreigners and even disquieted envoys. In the established kingdoms beyond the steppe, hospitality might be offered to allies, traders, or relatives, but seldom to someone who had previously plundered your territories or engaged in battle against you. On the Mongolian plains, however, the imperatives of survival superseded these distinctions. It was not that the Mongols overlooked historical grievances. Quite the contrary. Animosities could persist for generations, and retribution was a form of cultural value. But there was a comprehension, forged by the harsh conditions of nomadic existence, that out here the principles of hospitality took precedence over individual conflicts, at least for the duration that a guest was present within the gyr. Imagine a warrior, exhausted from weeks of travel, arriving at the encampment of a man whose cousin he had previously defeated in combat. In any other setting, this could have concluded with a knife in the stomach. On the steppe, it concluded with a bowl of hot mutton stew, a place to sleep near the fire, and the sharing of stories deep into the night. The instant he passed through that felt entrance, he ceased to be an enemy. He became a Zork, a person of the moment, a traveler under the host's safeguarding. This sacred suspension of animosity was, in part, a practical measure. To kill a guest was seen as an affront to Tangri and a transgression that could tarnish a family's reputation for generations, but it was also a question of status. The more generous a man was, the further his renown spread across the steppe, conveyed in the tales of those who had shared his fire. In Mongol culture, one's reputation was a type of currency as precious as one's animals. There was a subtle calculation in this benevolence as well. A former adversary who had been provided with warmth and food might reconsider drawing his bow against you in the future. Or perhaps, as a sign of respect, he might even convey your goodwill to his own people, thereby reducing hostilities without a single arrow being fired. In this manner, the Mongols engaged in a form of diplomacy that did not depend on written agreements or royal insignia. It was diplomacy conducted by firelight and shared sustenance, a testament that even in the most inhospitable region on earth, peace could commence with nothing more than a serving of fermented mare's milk. Hospitality among the Mongols was not an unplanned act. It was a carefully orchestrated display of respect, with each gesture intentional and each item imbued with significance. When a guest neared, the ritual commenced long before they stepped over the entrance of the gyr. Firstly, the host would emerge to receive them, assuming an open stance but without any sense of haste. To rush might suggest neediness. To remain inside for too long might appear unwelcoming. Equilibrium was paramount. The guest would be asked to alight from his horse, and the host might take the animal's reins, indicating that both the rider and his steed were now in their charge. The door covering of the gyr, which invariably faced south to greet the sun, was raised for the guest. Inside, the fire in the center burned with a consistent flame, its smoke ascending through the tuno, the circular opening at the apex. This fire was not merely for providing warmth, it was the spirit of the hearth, a protector of the household. Guests were required to move around it with caution, never to pass over it, as doing so was considered a grave offense. The arrangement of seating conveyed its own unspoken communication. The northern side, directly across from the entrance, was the position of greatest honor, designated for the guest. Here, they would be seated on cushions or rugs, positioned to face both the hearth and the doorway, a posture of deference and safety. Any weapons, if brought, were either put away or placed in clear view to one side, a subtle confirmation that no ill intent was present. Then followed the presentation of arag, the fermented mare's milk, served in a silver or wooden vessel. The guest would receive it with both hands, a motion indicating they carried no concealed weapon. To decline the beverage was unimaginable. It was to spurn not only the liquid, but also the connection it represented. Accompanying it were bread, cheese curds, or meat, contingent on the host's prosperity and the time of year. Conversation initiated slowly, frequently starting with blessings and observations on the weather, neutral subjects to transition into more significant discussions. This ceremony was not simply a matter of courtesy, it was a method of establishing trust in a region where trust was essential for survival. Every action, from the manner in which the bowl was held to the guest's seating position, reinforced the notion that, for this brief period, under this roof, they were welcome. For the Mongols, these procedures were not mere formalities. They were a living connection to their forebears, linking the present to centuries of custom. On the Mongolian steppe, food was never simply a source of energy. It was an unstated agreement. To partake in a meal together was to partake in trust. And once you had dined at another's hearth, a hidden bond was formed between you that could not be easily severed. This was particularly so when the offering was arag, the fermented mare's milk that was central to nomadic hospitality. Arag was more than a beverage, its production was an activity that mirrored the tempo of the steppe. Mares were milked multiple times each day, and the milk was poured into a leather container suspended near the jir's entrance, where it would be agitated and churned every time someone went by. This perpetual movement converted it into a mildly alcoholic, sharp-tasting drink, both invigorating and symbolic. To receive it was to receive the safeguarding of the household. To empty the vessel was to confirm that acceptance. Alongside the arag were the customary companions of the nomadic meal. Buurtzog, small pieces of fried bread, provided a crisp sweetness that balanced the drink's acidic flavor. Arul, dried curds made hard by the sun and wind, were a challenge for the teeth and a testament to the steppe's harsh environment, food crafted to endure overextended journeys. If the family had recently butchered an animal, the guest might be offered a hot mutton soup, rich with fat, served with thick noodles or dumplings known as booze. The sequence in which these foods were presented was significant. Arag was almost invariably served first. It was the preliminary gesture of goodwill between host and guest. Bread or curds came next to settle the stomach. Meat was the highest display of honor, for livestock represented wealth, and to provide fresh meat indicated that the host had given up something of value for your benefit. The act of eating together was not a hurried event. The guest was invited to have second and third helpings if possible, as a satisfied stomach was evidence of a host's generosity. In return, the guest might leave behind small tokens of appreciation, a small quantity of tea bricks, a pouch of tobacco, or simply the assurance of reciprocal kindness at a later time. In this transaction, food and drink transcended mere sustenance. They became a pact rendered in flavor, comprehended across different languages and territories. On the vast steppe, where writing materials were scarce, such pacts were far more lasting. The Mongol steppe was never a secluded territory. It was a junction. Traders from the Silk Road, Persian emissaries, Chinese academics, and even perplexed European explorers all found themselves at the entrance of a Mongol jir, squinting into the warm light of the fire after days or weeks in the unforgiving wind. And irrespective of their place of origin, religious beliefs, or physical features, they were received in accordance with the same hallowed principles that governed every nomadic family. For those from other lands, this reception could seem almost surreal. Imagine a Venetian trader, accustomed to the wary distrust of Mediterranean seaports, suddenly being guided into a felt-covered dwelling in a remote location. Before he could state his reason for being there, he would be given a steaming bowl of stew, a piece of bread, and a cup of arag, which, for someone unfamiliar with it, could be a startling experience for the palate. Yet to decline was out of the question. The host's honor was contained in that vessel. Many of these foreign guests observed in their journals that Mongol hospitality was exceptionally without conditions. There were no requests for payment, no assessment of whether you were deserving of the food or lodging. That being said, a prudent traveler understood to present some small gift in return prior to his departure: tea, fabric, beads, or even a melody from his native land. Such acts were not payment for the hospitality, they were a tribute to it. Difficulties with language seldom presented an issue. The customs of welcome, seating the guest in the position of honor, presenting food with both hands, replenishing their cup before it was drained, communicated more effectively than any spoken words. Even the sequence of the meal's courses conveyed trust: arrog first, then curds, then meat. By the time genuine conversation commenced, often with the aid of translators or through a combination of gestures and common words, the basis of mutual respect had already been established. These interactions were not merely acts of goodwill for their own sake. They were also components of a much larger network. A traveler who was well cared for would share tales of generosity across deserts and oceans, enhancing the host's standing far beyond the range of their own travels. In a culture where reputation could spread more rapidly than military forces, a single act of welcome could be as influential as 100 warriors. Thus, the Mongols' receptiveness to outsiders was not born of innocence. It was strategic, spiritual, and profoundly human all at once. On the Mongolian steppe, agreements were not formalized with ink. They were experienced in broth and confirmed with shared servings of arrog. Hospitality was not simply a matter of kindness, it was a political act conducted around a fire. A guest might come as a cautious representative from a competing clan and depart as an ally, connected by the recollection of generosity as much as by any verbal commitment. When two factions aimed for peace or collaboration, the initial move was seldom a formal conference. Instead, the host clan would organize a great meal. Horses would be butchered, a lavish display, as horse meat was kept for significant events. The jur would be prepared to welcome the guests with carpets and cushions that had been recently cleaned, and the most exquisite eating utensils would be polished until they shone in the lamplight. The guests would be given seats in the position of honor, directly across from the entrance, a silent indication that they were under the complete protection of the household. The food itself was the medium of diplomacy. The more abundant the selection, meats, fresh dairy products, confections, the more explicit the message. We hold this meeting in high regard, and we possess the means to do you honor. In Mongol culture, to present anything less than one's best at such a time would be to confess to either weakness or lack of interest. Conversations during these events were never hastened. They started with blessings and casual conversation, gradually putting both parties at ease. A host might speak of the valor of the guest's ancestors or mention common dangers from faraway tribes. Between the different parts of the meal, cups were refilled repeatedly, and with each serving, the mood became more relaxed. The distinction between negotiation and festivity became indistinct. This ceremony operated on a level deeper than mere words. The act of sharing food and lodging served as a powerful reminder that existence on the steppe relied on mutual support. When you had partaken of someone's fire, the idea of directing your bow against them was difficult to dismiss. By the conclusion of the feast, the visitors frequently departed with more than just satisfied appetites. They took with them new allegiances. The agreement might be as straightforward as a commitment to trade or as significant as a promise of military support. And while no written document chronicled these connections, they persisted in memory, maintained by honor, and the assurance that subsequent visits would be met with the same hospitality. In this manner, Mongol hospitality was not merely a custom, it was a form of governance intertwined with the very essence of survival and influence on the steppe. To pass through the entrance of a Mongol jur was to step into not merely a residence, but a hallowed area governed by unwritten regulations. A visitor might be received with a warm welcome, but this did not grant them license to act in any manner they chose. On the steppe, hospitality was accompanied by a set of rules, and to violate them was to risk causing offense to your host, or worse, to the spirits that protected the household. The most crucial rule commenced at the very entrance. One must never step upon the wooden threshold. It was more than a simple piece of wood. It represented the line between the untamed world outside and the sanctity of the interior. To tread upon it was believed to bring misfortune not only to the guest but to the entire family. Once within, the hearth was the core of the ger, and it was treated with profound respect. Guests were forbidden to step over it, to disturb its fire without asking, or to dispose of any waste within it. The fire was the essence of life, its flames connected to the eternal blue sky, and to show it disrespect was comparable to insulting the deities. The seating arrangement had its own implicit structure. The northern area facing the entrance was designated for esteemed guests. The western side was traditionally for the men, and the eastern side was for the women. To sit in the incorrect location, particularly without an invitation, was a violation of proper conduct. When food or drink was presented, it was to be received with both hands and without any delay. To refuse was not only impolite, it implied a lack of trust. Even if the guest did not care for the sour taste of arrog or found the mutton to be excessively fatty, they were expected to take at least a small taste or bite. To express dissatisfaction with the meal, no matter how discreetly, was never permissible. There were also less obvious, more nuanced rules. It was considered improper to point one's feet toward the hearth, as was touching another person's head, which was regarded as the most sacred part of the body. Weapons were either to be left outside or kept in full view, but not touched, to indicate peaceful intentions. These customs were seldom explicitly stated. A guest was expected to learn them through observation or from prior experience. Yet they had a function beyond simple politeness. They fostered an environment of mutual respect, guaranteeing that the delicate bond of trust between host and guest would not be broken. To follow these rules was to show honor not only to your host, but also to the ancient spirit of the steppe, a spirit that required reverence from all who journeyed beneath its vast sky. On the Mongolian steppe, the welcome a visitor received was never in doubt. It was a foregone conclusion. But what was provided and the manner in which it was provided varied with the passage of the seasons. The immense grasslands followed a pattern older than human recollection, and hospitality kept pace with that rhythm. During the warmth of summer, life on the steppe was at its most prosperous. Herds fed on abundant grass, mares yielded plentiful milk, and the arrog containers hanging at the ger's entrance were in continuous use, guaranteeing a constant flow for guests. Fresh dairy products were the main feature of the table: clotted cream, yogurt, and curds, along with arrog. Bread was abundant, and meals could feature tender portions of mutton or goat. Visitors arriving in the summer might find themselves included in the informal social events that occurred across the steppe, with music, storytelling, and wrestling competitions that lasted into the extended evening hours. Autumn was the period of preparation. Animals were fattened for the difficult months to come, and the process of slaughtering commenced. Guests during this season might be treated to korkog, a substantial dish of mutton cooked slowly with heated stones within a sealed container, its rich fragrance pervading the ger. There was a palpable sense of immediacy in the atmosphere. Every encounter, every shared meal, was tinged with the awareness of winter's impending arrival. Then came winter, when the steppe became white and the wind transformed into a tangible, cutting presence. Hospitality during this time was as much a matter of survival as it was of custom. Fresh milk was in short supply. Arrog was replaced by salty milk tea, made rich with butter for warmth and sustenance. Meat, often dried or frozen in the open, was the main food, sometimes simply boiled to save fuel. Guests were invited to sit nearer to the fire, and conversation was more restrained, interrupted by the sound of the wind outside. To refuse a traveler in winter was inconceivable. It was to condemn them to death. Spring ushered in a tentative revival. Grass reappeared slowly, and herds began to produce milk once more, though the quantities were meager. Hospitality was modest during this period, yet no less genuine: a bowl of fresh milk, a small helping of cheese, a promise of more prosperous days to come. In every season, the fundamental nature of Mongol hospitality did not alter: to give what you possessed without reservation, and to serve as a reminder to the traveler that even in the most unforgiving of lands, there was still comfort to be found. Although the Mongol Empire has long since become a part of history, the principles of hospitality that once united warriors, herders, and traders continue to exist in the gir smoke that rises over the contemporary steppe. In urban centers like Ulaanbaatar, life may proceed at a faster pace, and high-rise buildings have taken the place of yurts in the cityscape. But venture beyond the paved thoroughfares, and you will discover the same age-old welcome awaiting you. Today, many Mongol families continue to lead a nomadic lifestyle, guiding their livestock with the changing seasons and erecting their girs beneath the expansive open sky. An unfamiliar person who arrives on horseback or by motorcycle is received in much the same manner as they would have been centuries ago, with warmth, sustenance, and a seat in the position of honor. Arag is still served, bread is still shared, and the hearth fire is still regarded with deep respect. Even for those who reside in towns, the spirit of hospitality endures. It is not unusual for travelers to be welcomed into a home after a casual encounter, offered tea and biscuits while sharing stories. The traditional belief that a guest is a blessing from Tangri and that to turn them away is to court misfortune still holds true. This persistence is, in part, a matter of cultural identity. Hospitality is regarded as a defining characteristic of being Mongol, a direct connection to the eminence of their forebears. But it is also a result of the ongoing challenges of the land. The steppe can still be unforgiving, with immense distances and unpredictable weather. Acts of kindness are not merely symbolic, they are a practical form of assurance for the day when you, too, might be the one in need of shelter. In more recent times, tourism has introduced new types of visitors: photographers seeking the perfect light, historians following the roots of Genghis Khan, and backpackers challenging themselves against the untamed landscape. Countless individuals depart with tales of being received into girs without any forewarning, of being given food and lodging with no mention of currency ever being made. For the Mongols, I understood this was not an act of benevolence. It was the carrying out of a responsibility, an obligation that surpasses material riches, political affiliations, or faith. They hold the conviction that as long as the unending cerulean heavens oversee the steppe, the ancient customs must endure. Consequently, Mongol hospitality persists not as a charming artifact, but as a vibrant, active custom, possessing enough strength to transform unfamiliar faces into companions, and occasionally to convert past foes into confederates. By the fall of 1614, Japan was a nation that appeared tranquil on the surface, yet was internally preparing for another tempest. The Tokugawa shogunate, established by Tokugawa Ieyasu following his conclusive triumph at the conflict of Sekigahara in 1600, now governed from Edo. On paper, Ieyasu had stepped down, passing the title of shogun to his son Hidetada. In truth, the aged warlord continued to manipulate the levers of authority, observing the country with the tired gaze of a man who was aware of how rapidly solidarity could disintegrate. A single significant adversary persisted: the Toyotomi clan. Formerly the dominant force in Japan under the famed Toyotomi Hideyoshi, his son, Toyotomi Hideyori, had been merely a boy when Sekigahara concluded his family's ascendancy. Presently, in his early 20s, he served as an emblem for everyone who resented the Tokugawa regime. Hideyori was not simply a remnant of a collapsed dynasty. He was affluent, had strong political ties, and most perilously, was firmly established inside Osaka Castle, the most formidable stronghold in the country. Osaka Castle was something more than mere stone ramparts and watchtowers. It served as a declaration of Toyotomi might. It featured immense moats, soaring battlements, and storehouses filled with adequate food and provisions to endure a protracted siege. Traders, unaffiliated samurai, and aspiring lords continued to be drawn to its shelter, augmenting its garrison. The castle's location in Japan's core lent it strategic significance. In the event of a rebellion, Osaka could function as both a focal point for assembly and an invincible headquarters. Whispers started to circulate across the land. Murmurs of Toyotomi allies congregating, of armaments being accumulated, of clandestine letters being sent to daimyo who remained faithful to Hideyoshi's legacy. The Tokugawa court in Edo received these accounts with escalating apprehension. For Ieyasu, this was not solely a matter of military danger. It concerned the potential for the Toyotomi to become a political substitute for his authority, attracting dissatisfied warriors like moths drawn to a flame. In the public eye, the two factions upheld a pretense of cordiality. Behind closed doors, both readied themselves for the unavoidable conflict. Ieyasu, the veteran tactician, realized that to safeguard the Tokugawa shogunate for future generations, the Toyotomi presence in Osaka needed to be completely eradicated. Hideyori, who was raised in a world of fluctuating allegiances, knew that to stay alive he could not display any sign of weakness. The scene was arranged. Two formidable houses, one aged and methodical, the other youthful and defiant, were both ensnared in a silent battle of wills under the watchful eyes of the whole nation. The delicate tranquility was on the verge of shattering. The path to the siege did not commence with an abrupt collision of blades, but with methodical maneuvers in a political contest that Tokugawa Ieyasu played with greater skill than anyone else alive. I knew that overt hostility without a valid reason could sway neutral daimyo against him. What he required instead was a justification, a pretext that would make conflict appear not only unavoidable, but also just. The catalyst appeared in the guise of a temple bell. In 1614, the Toyotomi financed the recasting of a large bell for the Hokoji Temple in Kyoto. After its completion, an inscription was carved with a Buddhist entreaty for peace, concluding with the words, "Koka Anko, may the nation be at peace." A benign benediction in most people's view, but for Ieyasu, or more accurately, for those interpreting the message for him, the particular sequence of characters could be construed as a malediction against the Tokugawa clan. The character for peace was positioned in a manner that seemed to isolate Ieyasu from a long life, and the shogunate seized upon this as proof of Toyotomi impertinence. It was a weak rationale, but within the tense political atmosphere, it sufficed. Ieyasu's emissaries charged Hideyori with conspiring to rebel. Missives were sent throughout Japan, cautioning daimyo that the Toyotomi were gearing up for war and needed to be addressed before they could disrupt the kingdom. Numerous lords, keen to demonstrate their allegiance or simply to deflect suspicion, started to furnish soldiers and supplies to the Tokugawa cause. For Hideyori, the charge was both offensive and perilous. His counselors advised him to seek peace, possibly by dispatching hostages or by demolishing sections of Osaka Castle's defenses. Nevertheless, a defiant sentiment prevailed in the Toyotomi camp. Many were convinced that surrendering at this point would only accelerate their demise. Samurai devoted to his father's memory poured into Osaka, some of them ronin with nothing more to lose. The castle's defenders expanded to perhaps 100,000 combatants, a force of impressive magnitude but diverse in its discipline and loyalty. The scene was now prepared not for diplomatic talks, but for a showdown. By autumn, the Tokugawa army, immense, orderly, and well outfitted, was advancing toward Osaka. The political bell had been rung, and now the drums of conflict started to sound. By late November of 1614, the Tokugawa army was advancing. It was a military power that eclipsed any Japan had witnessed since Sekigahara. Projections varied from 150,000 to over 200,000 soldiers, mustered from nearly every domain loyal to the shogunate. Under the command of Tokugawa Ieyasu himself, alongside his son, Shogun Hidetada, it proceeded with the meticulousness of a country mobilized for a final triumph. Osaka Castle, however, was not a simple objective. Hideyori's defenders numbered approximately 90,000 to 100,000. This army was augmented by waves of unaffiliated ronin. These men, although not tied to any daimyo, carried with them the experience of previous conflicts and a readiness to fight with audacious bravery. Under the direction of commanders such as Goto Matabe, Kimura Shigenari, and Sanada Yukimura, the renowned tactician from the Sanada clan, the Toyotomi forces readied themselves to transform Osaka into an impregnable fortress. The castle's defenses were impressive. It boasted triple moats, soaring stone walls, and huge gates engineered to channel aggressors into lethal kill zones. The supply depots were overflowing with rice, dried fish, and other necessities, sufficient to withstand an extended siege. The defenders felt certain that the harsh cold of winter would be to their advantage. The Tokugawa army, positioned in open fields and hastily erected forts, would be forced to face the icy gales from Osaka Bay. Ieyasu's approach was systematic. Instead of initiating a rash head-on attack, he commanded the building of siege lines that would encircle the castle. Earthworks, watchtowers, and artillery emplacements began to appear. Cannons, many of which were obtained through trade with the Portuguese, were placed to bombard the walls. The aim was to suffocate Osaka into surrender, severing its reinforcements and diminishing morale before the decisive assault. Within the castle, Hideyori endeavored to preserve cohesion among his varied allies. The involvement of Sanada Yukimura was particularly noteworthy. He started to build a sequence of external defenses known as the Sanadamaru, a defensive barbican on the southwestern flank that would shortly become the center of some of the most intense combat of the whole campaign. By December, the siege had fully commenced. The moats would freeze over during the night. The air resonated with the sound of musket fire, and the earth shook from the force of cannonballs. Winter had arrived in Osaka, and with it, the initial trial of whether the Toyotomi could endure the power of the Tokugawa. If Osaka Castle represented the core of the Toyotomi defense, then the Sanadamaru was its sharpened spearhead. Constructed by Sanada Yukimura on the southwestern approach to the castle, this defensive structure was not just an outer fortification. I saw it was a killing field engineered to drain the Tokugawa army before they could even make contact with the main ramparts. The design of the Sanadamaru was ingenious. Encircled by its own moat and linked to the main castle by only a slender pathway, it enabled defenders to focus their fire on any aggressor who ventured to get close. High earthen battlements were packed with matchlock marksmen, while hidden firing posts allowed arrows and bullets to pour down from unforeseen directions. The Tokugawa, eager to probe the defenses, initiated a series of attacks in early December. Their numbers were vast, but Yukimura's men, many clad in the red armor that became their somber trademark, held their ground. Waves of assailants found themselves stuck in mud or clambering up steep slopes under a barrage of projectiles. Arquebuses discharged in disciplined volleys, felling samurai in mid-attack. When the foe came too near, the defenders launched counter-assaults with spears and swords, driving them back into the lethal zones. Enhancing the defenders' upper hand were the cannons positioned inside the Sanadamaru, provided from Hideyori's reserves. These cannons bombarded the Tokugawa siege structures, creating breaches in their formations and dispersing their soldiers. The psychological impact was as powerful as the physical destruction. Tokugawa soldiers started to feel a sense of dread at any command to move on the redoubt. One attack concluded in ruin when the assailants trying to scale the walls were confronted by a swift countercharge led by Yukimura himself. His presence on the battlefield, encouraging his men with a composed yet firm attitude, became legendary. Tokugawa forces were repelled, leaving the area strewn with the deceased and injured. For Ieyasu, the Sanadamaru was a persistent annoyance that could not be removed. Weeks of siege had not managed to breach it, and every unsuccessful attempt strengthened the resolve of the defenders within Osaka Castle. Even the biting cold appeared to be on the side of Yukimura's men, who were familiar with every part of their fortification and could rotate their duties to maintain fresh combatants on the walls. By the middle of December, it was apparent to the Tokugawa commanders that the Sanadamaru could not be captured by a frontal assault. If Osaka Castle were to be taken, it would not be through Yukimura's gate. When frontal attacks on Osaka Castle proved fruitless, particularly the sanguinary setbacks at the Sanadamaru, Tokugawa Ieyasu changed his strategy from assaulting the walls to shattering the defenders' resolve. If he was unable to breach the gates with blades, he would crush them into submission with rock and iron. By mid-December of 1614, the Tokugawa siege lines were bristling with artillery. These were not typical Japanese cannons. A significant number had been acquired from Portuguese merchants or modified from European models. Heavy culverins and more compact swivel guns were hauled into place on elevated earthworks, directed not just at the external defenses, but at the castle's interior. The aim was unambiguous: to transform Osaka into a location where mere existence felt like a loss. The bombardment commenced, continuing day and night. The sound of cannon fire echoed through the winter atmosphere. Each blast was succeeded by the splintering sound of wood, the disintegration of stone, and occasionally the horrifying cries of those hit by the explosion. Structures within the castle grounds, storehouses, barracks, even living quarters, were demolished. Fires erupted, releasing columns of dark smoke into the frozen sky. However, Ieyasu's strategy was not limited to physical ruin. The incessant noise, the lack of sleep, and the escalating feeling of despair were designed to weaken morale. The defenders, although secure behind substantial walls and moats, were never able to let their guard down. Every hour held the potential for another fatal strike, intensifying the psychological burden. This pressure was compounded by rumors disseminated by Tokugawa operatives. Messages were either smuggled in or yelled from across the moat, offering clemency to those who forsook Hideyori and pledged allegiance to the shogunate. Some defenders rejected these offers with scorn. Others, particularly the less devoted Ronin, started to question whether the struggle was worth their lives. Inside Osaka, Hideyori and his commanders attempted to resist this assault on their spirit. Public events were organized to commemorate fallen soldiers. Food was distributed freely to maintain spirits. Sanada Yukimura persisted in conducting inspections of the walls, a tangible sign that the leadership remained robust. Nonetheless, the strain of the siege was palpable. The inhabitants of Osaka Castle were facing not just a military operation, but a slow, relentless war on their senses. Ieyasu understood that in siege warfare, the victor is often the one who can withstand the hardship the longest, and he was confident in the Tokugawa's endurance. By the end of December in 1614, weeks of bombardment had made their impact. Osaka Castle was still standing. Its primary walls and moats had remained intact. But the harm to its external defenses and the unceasing psychological pressure were undeniable. Tokugawa Ieyasu, always the tactician, saw that prolonging the siege through the harshest part of winter could deplete his own troops and empty his treasury. He chose instead to conclude the campaign under conditions that would diminish the Toyotomi's strength without the carnage of a final assault. Emissaries were dispatched under banners of truce. In official terms, the discussions were presented as a chance to bring peace back to the kingdom. In truth, both parties came to the negotiations with widely different objectives. For the Tokugawa, the goal was to strip Osaka of its capacity to resist in the times to come. For Hideyori, it was to ensure his clan's continued existence and to keep the fortress whole for as long as he could. The talks were strained. The Tokugawa insisted that Osaka Castle's outer defenses, which included the vast moats, be filled in and its fortifications diminished. Hideyori's delegates resisted, but the duress of the siege and the wish to safeguard the civilian populace were significant factors. With supplies still adequate but morale beginning to weaken, the Toyotomi leaders eventually consented to a peace accord. The conditions appeared simple. The Toyotomi would cease all military activities, and the Tokugawa would pull back their troops. But Ieyasu had cleverly included a critical benefit for himself. By having the moats filled and the most robust outer fortifications dismantled, Osaka Castle's defensive capability would be permanently compromised. In the subsequent days, work teams arrived to fill the moats with soil and debris. The defenders, likely relieved by the cessation of the constant cannon fire, did not completely understand the strategic catastrophe this entailed. Once the snow had gone and the season for military campaigns had returned, their stronghold would be significantly more exposed to a fresh assault. By the new year, the Tokugawa army started its retreat. The winter campaign had concluded. Osaka had held out. Hideyori stayed in his castle, and to a casual onlooker, the peace looked authentic. But concealed beneath the courteous wording of the truce was a reality that both sides were aware of. The conflict was merely on hold, not resolved. The castle had been defanged, and Ieyasu had no intention of allowing the Toyotomi threat to persist indefinitely. The subsequent campaign was destined to be conclusive. The winter campaign concluded along with the snow, but the tranquility in Osaka was a delicate facade. Within the castle's confines, daily existence reverted to a state of apparent normality. Fires were kindled without the dread of cannonballs, marketplaces were back in business, and the sounds of construction took the place of the roar of battle. Nevertheless, everyone was aware that the truce was merely a thin sheet of ice covering deep, frigid waters. The clause in the treaty about filling the moats had effectively crippled the castle's defensive capabilities. The enormous moats that had once held Tokugawa soldiers at a distance were now nothing more than shallow trenches or leveled ground, leaving the walls vulnerable to a direct attack. Some Toyotomi supporters murmured that agreeing to such conditions had been a disastrous error, while others argued it was the sole means to prevent Osaka's ruin during the winter. Despite this weakness, Hideyori and his generals started to get ready for the prospect of a new conflict. Armaments were mended and replenished, and proficient ronin were once again enlisted from all over Japan. The most renowned among them, Sanada Yukimura, went back to his task of bolstering the Sanadamaru and reinforcing the remaining fortifications. Without the moats, the defense would depend on smaller fortified positions and intense hand-to-hand combat. The Tokugawa, on their side, lost no time in seeking a reason to violate the truce. Ieyasu's spies in Kyoto and Osaka documented every action within the castle, every new warrior's arrival, every whispered scheme. Letters were seized, and rumors were circulated that the Toyotomi were conspiring to unite anti-Tokugawa groups across the nation. By the spring, the political climate had become strained again. Ieyasu accused Hideyori of breaking the peace agreement, citing the enlistment of more ronin as evidence of aggressive intentions. Whether this was factual or simply a pretext was of little importance. The shogunate had all the justification it needed to declare war in the eyes of the daimyo. In Osaka, the Toyotomi court engaged in heated discussions. Some recommended that Hideyori should try to negotiate once more to dispatch hostages to Edo in a final effort at conciliation. Others contended that the Tokugawa would never be content until the Toyotomi name was completely wiped out, making defiance the only respectable course of action. By the early summer of 1615, the period for discussion had ended. The Tokugawa armies started to assemble again, this time under the clear skies of the campaigning season. The summer campaign was approaching, and for Osaka Castle, it was to be its final defense. In May of 1615, the Tokugawa army advanced once more towards Osaka, this time with no thought of peaceful resolution. The military force was vast. Over 150,000 soldiers, a combination of samurai, ashigaru, and allied domain troops from all over Japan. Leading them were Shogun Hidetada and the ever-vigilant Tokugawa Ieyasu. Now he was resolved to eliminate the Toyotomi menace for good. The Toyotomi, although fewer in number, had not been inactive. Hideyori had assembled approximately 55,000 defenders. A large portion of them were seasoned ronin who had been hardened by years of aimless wandering after Sekigahara. At the forefront was Sanada Yukimura, who was once again given the responsibility of strengthening the castle's defenses despite the lack of the protective moats. His approach was to be proactive, to confront the Tokugawa on the battlefield before they could completely surround the castle. The initial significant encounter occurred at Doji, where Toyotomi troops under the command of Goto Matabe tried to stop the Tokugawa's progress. Matabe's soldiers fought with great courage, but a mix of disorganized coordination and the sheer numbers of the enemy compelled them to fall back. Matabe himself was slain in the turmoil, a severe blow to the Toyotomi spirit. Concurrently, at Yao and Wakai, other Toyotomi units attempted to challenge the Tokugawa's flanks. Sanada Yukimura commanded one such unit in a sequence of bold counter-assaults, leveraging his extensive knowledge of the landscape to harass and obstruct the enemy. His soldiers in red armor attacked with the speed of lightning, causing significant losses before pulling back to prevent being encircled. In spite of these valiant defensive actions, the sheer weight of the Tokugawa's manpower started to have its effect. The absence of the moats meant that the enemy could advance their siege lines perilously close to Osaka Castle itself. Cannon fire once again rattled the walls, and Tokugawa sappers labored to weaken the gates. By the middle of June, the Tokugawa had consolidated their hold. Minor battles broke out almost every day, with the defenders conducting raids to set fire to siege equipment and disrupt supply routes. But each raid came at the cost of men that the Toyotomi could ill afford to lose. Inside the castle, the mood was strained but determined. There was no hope of receiving clemency if they were to be defeated. The summer campaign had started with bloodshed and flames, and the encirclement was tightening around Osaka. The scene was set for the pivotal battle that would decide not only the destiny of the Toyotomi, but also the future of Japan itself. By the end of June in 1615, the siege had reached its peak. The Tokugawa army had advanced their positions almost to the castle's walls, their artillery firing relentlessly, day and night. Fires ignited throughout the outer sections, and with each passing hour, the defenders had fewer areas to which they could fall back. Sanada Yukimura, the unwavering core of the Toyotomi opposition, knew that the end was drawing near, but he was unwilling to yield without a final defiant act. The crucial confrontation took place at the Battle of Tennoji, fought just beyond Osaka's southern entrance. Yukimura spearheaded a desperate counter-assault, leading his red-armored soldiers in a fierce charge that temporarily shattered the Tokugawa formations. It was a brilliant, almost self-destructive tactic, and for a fleeting moment it appeared that the Toyotomi might shift the momentum of the battle, but the enemy's greater numbers converged from all directions, and Yukimura was fatally injured in the ensuing turmoil. His final recorded words, urging his men to continue the fight, resonated through the ranks even as his standard toppled. With their most skilled commander lost, the Toyotomi forces crumbled under the unceasing onslaught. The Tokugawa advanced, breaking through the compromised gates and pouring into the castle premises. Combat raged in courtyards and passageways, with the glint of steel visible in the smoke-laden air. Both civilians and soldiers rushed to find safety, although for many there was no escape. In the main tower, Toyotomi Hideyori and his mother Yodogimi opted not to be captured by the enemy. As the flames engulfed the adjacent structures, they performed seppuku, taking their own lives in the warrior tradition. The tower itself was ignited, its massive wooden beams groaning and giving way as the sky above Osaka became dark with smoke. By nightfall, the siege was concluded. The Tokugawa had achieved a complete and merciless triumph. The Toyotomi clan was removed from political influence, and Osaka Castle was left in ruins. The city, which had once been a bustling hub of commerce and culture, was now marked by scars and silence. For Tokugawa Ieyasu, this was the concluding chapter in the consolidation of Japan. With his adversaries vanquished, his family's dominion over the nation would endure for over 200 years. Yet the cost was substantial. The siege of Osaka had resulted in tens of thousands of deaths and left a legacy of both wonder and sorrow. It is remembered as the final major conflict of Japan's samurai era. Kutulun came into the world around 1260, at a time when the Mongol Empire was still among the most extensive and formidable powers in history. She was a direct heir of Genghis Khan through her father Kaidu, the influential Khan of the Chagatai Khanate, a sovereign whose dominion covered a large portion of Central Asia. This was not a tranquil, established territory of stone urban centers and serene farmlands. Kutulun's upbringing took place on the vast steppes, where existence hinged on quickness, physical power, and a profound knowledge of the environment. For a Mongol child, life commenced in the saddle. Horses were as crucial as the air and water, and Kutulun mastered riding before she could walk with confidence. From her earliest years, she was instructed in the traditions of her people, learning to shoot a bow while riding at full speed, grappling with her older siblings until clouds of dust billowed, and interpreting the signs of the wind and the livestock. These were not mere hobbies. They were abilities that determined the line between survival and demise in a world characterized by conflict and constant movement. Her father, Kaidu, was embroiled in perpetual political and military conflicts with his relatives at the Great Khan's court, most notably Kublai Khan in China. This situation meant that Kutulun was raised not in the protected opulence of a palace, but in army encampments, surrounded by warriors, military planners, and the ceaseless motion of armed forces. The sound of clashing weapons and the cries of soldiers were as commonplace to her as the melodies sung around the campfire at night. Mongol society prized strength and proficiency over simple ancestry, and Kutulun's abilities quickly became too prominent to overlook. Even as a young girl, she could ride for longer periods, wrestle with more force, and shoot with greater accuracy than boys who were older than her. She was not pushed to take the conventional route of a Mongol noblewoman, which involved arranging marriages and overseeing the domestic affairs of a nomadic family, but was instead trained alongside her father's soldiers. Her mother and the other women in the camp still imparted to her the domestic skills anticipated of a nobleman's daughter. However, Kutulun's future was already taking a different form. Her parents recognized that in the severe competitive political climate of the late Mongol Empire, a daughter who could command admiration on the battlefield would be as precious as any son. By the time she was in her teenage years, Kutulun had already started to build a name for herself, not just as Kaidu's daughter, but as a warrior in her own right. By the period Kutulun entered her teenage years, her existence was already deeply connected to the cadence of warfare. The Mongol Empire of her formative years was no longer the cohesive entity it had been under Genghis Khan. It had become fragmented, with competing branches of the ruling family struggling for supremacy. Her father, Kaidu, stood out as one of the most powerful among these contenders. He was a military commander whose resistance to Kublai Khan put him in a state of continuous conflict with the Yuan dynasty to the east and rival Khanates to the west. In this chaotic environment, Kutulun was not just a bystander. She journeyed with her father's forces, not as a symbolic presence, but as an engaged combatant. The military campaigns were arduous undertakings. They involved lengthy journeys across deserts and mountains, unexpected encounters with enemy scouts, and large-scale battles where the destinies of entire territories could change within a day. Kutulun demonstrated her capabilities in these settings, handling her bow and spear with the skill of an experienced warrior. Historical records, especially those from the Venetian explorer Marco Polo, portray her as being without equal on the battlefield. He asserted that she could snatch an enemy soldier from his horse, pull him back to her own ranks, and achieve this without slowing her speed. This was not an embellished account intended to glamorize her persona. Mongol cavalry strategies required such skills, and Kutulun was a master of them. Her father appreciated her presence not only for her combat prowess, but also for the boost in morale it provided. The soldiers fought with greater determination, knowing that Kutulun was among them, a tangible representation of their cause and evidence that bravery was not restricted by gender. Her white horse became a well-known feature on the battlefield, and her red-lined armor identified her as a force to be reckoned with. It was during these campaigns that Cutulun cultivated the fierce autonomy and strategic thinking that would characterize her later renown. She learned to interpret the dynamics of a battle, to foresee enemy actions, and to attack at the ideal moment. These were not abilities gained solely through training. They were developed in the turmoil of actual combat, where errors had fatal consequences. By her early 20s, Cutulun was not merely the daughter of Kaidu, but one of his most reliable commanders. Her fame as a warrior princess had extended far beyond the Chagatai Khanate, garnering both respect and envy in equal amounts. Among the Mongols, the sport of Burki wrestling was more than just a physical contest. It served as a measure of power, quickness, and integrity. It was held during festivals, celebrations, and tribal meetings. A win in the wrestling arena could bestow a level of renown comparable to a victory in battle. For Cutulun, whose abilities were already on par with the most skilled warriors, it presented another platform to demonstrate her prowess. According to the tales, Cutulun presented a challenge to the men of the steppe. She declared she would only wed the man who could overcome her in a wrestling match. This was not a mere empty claim. Wrestling among the Mongols was a competition without any weight restrictions, and her adversaries would be fully grown warriors, many of them seasoned by combat. Nevertheless, Cutulun was aware of her own capabilities. Years of instruction in horsemanship, archery, and the demanding physical nature of steppe life had endowed her with a physique and reflexes perfectly suited for this type of competition. When the initial suitors stepped up, the matches were over in a flash. Cutulun's method was precise and conclusive. She would trip a leg, alter her balance with incredible speed, and throw her opponent to the ground before the audience had even finished their applause. Her triumphs were not only physical, but also mental. Each man who was defeated by her contributed to her reputation of being unbeatable. But her challenge was not solely about physical strength. It was her method of asserting control over her own future. In an era when marriages among the nobility were frequently political deals, Cutulun utilized wrestling to establish her own conditions. If no man could defeat her, then no one could compel her into a marriage she did not desire. As her reputation spread, more suitors attempted to test their fortune. Some journeyed from far-off regions for the opportunity. Yet they all experienced the same outcome. They were thrown to the ground and dismissed with their pride injured. The challenge evolved into a legendary tale. It was talked about in marketplaces and celebrated in the songs of bards. To secure Cutulun's hand, one first had to bring her to the ground. No one ever succeeded. For the spectators, it was a form of entertainment. For Cutulun, it was a declaration. She would not be a passive object in the contests of men. On the sun-baked plains of the steppe, in the midst of the wrestling circle, she was her own sovereign. More powerful, quicker, and more astute than any who dared to confront her, Cutulun's wrestling challenge soon evolved into something more than a mere test of physical prowess. It transformed into a high-stakes competition involving riches and honor. To discourage less serious contenders and to lend more gravity to her conditions, she established a new rule. Any man who desired to wrestle her for the prize of marriage was required to stake 100 horses. Should he be defeated, she would retain them. If he emerged victorious, he would receive both the horses and her hand in marriage. In the horse-centric society of the Mongols, this was no small wager. Horses were the very essence of steppe life, serving as transportation, a measure of wealth, and a symbol of social standing all in one. To bet 100 horses was to put a substantial part of one's wealth at risk. It also implied that the men who ventured to face her were not only sure of their own strength, but were also prepared to gamble a considerable fortune on hooves. Cutulun did not let her supporters down. Time and again, her suitors found themselves forcefully thrown to the ground, their shoulders pinned to the dirt. The contest concluded before they could even attempt a recovery. Each defeat resulted in the transfer of a valuable herd of horses into Kutulun's ownership. The white, bay, and chestnut horses increased in number under her supervision until she was said to possess thousands. Marco Polo, who asserted to have heard of her achievements directly during his travels, approximated her herd to be around 10,000. These triumphs elevated her legend beyond the confines of the wrestling ring. She was no longer just the warrior princess who charged into battle. She was the undisputed champion whose skill had amassed a fortune in living, breathing riches. For some, she became an object of respect. For others, a source of vexation. Every man who failed to defeat her lost more than just his horses. He lost his reputation in the eyes of the entire tribe. But the wager was never solely about avarice. By setting such a high price, Kutulun made sure that only the most resolute would dare to make an attempt, thereby weeding out the lukewarm and the foolish. It was also a means of maintaining authority over her marital destiny. No father, no Khan, could compel her to agree to a match that had not been won in the ring. By the time her herd reached its fabled proportions, Kutulun's challenge had become the subject of songs and stories. Suitors continued to arrive, but they did so with the knowledge that the chances were stacked against them, not because she was fortunate, but because she was the best. While her wrestling triumphs brought her renown throughout the Mongol world, Kutulun's real strength was displayed in the saddle, where the light-hearted contests of sport transformed into the lethal confrontations of war. Her father, Kaidu, was perpetually involved in military campaigns against competing Khans, and Kutulun was not one to merely observe from a distance. She charged into the heart of the battle, her red-adorned armor shining in the sunlight, her bow and spear always in action. Contemporary records, including those from Marco Polo, asserted that she was without equal in the skill of capturing enemies alive from their horses. Amidst the turmoil of battle, she would select a rider, reduce the distance at full speed, and pull him from his saddle in a single, powerful move, dragging her prisoner back through the chaos to her own ranks. This accomplishment demanded more than just brute force. It called for accuracy, perfect timing, and the audacious courage to charge directly into peril. Her role in the army was more than just symbolic. Kaidu frequently assigned her the task of leading flanking maneuvers or capturing crucial positions on the battlefield. The soldiers she commanded held her in high regard, not just because she was their Khan's daughter, but because she had demonstrated her abilities time and time again in the heat of battle. Warriors fought with greater determination when Kutulun was present, drawing inspiration from the sight of a leader who could outdo them in sport and equal them in warfare. The combination of her wrestling and military fame forged a distinct persona. Kutulun was not only a champion of the wrestling ring, but also a formidable force on the steppe. Her proficiency in both fields solidified her power and independence in a manner that few women, even among the Mongols, could attain. Her adversaries, however, did not hold this same admiration. In the courts of her rivals, Kutulun was portrayed as a perilous figure, one whose disregard for marital conventions and skill in battle disrupted the delicate balance of political alliances. Each time she bested a suitor or overcame a force aligned with the UN or other rivals, she was making a clear statement. The daughter of Kaidu could not be subjugated. For Kutulun, wrestling and warfare were two aspects of the same reality. Whether in the sandy circle or on the open plain, the principles were straightforward. Outperform your adversary, dominate the encounter, and never relinquish the territory you have secured. Kutulun's existence was not solely determined by her own accomplishments, but also by her profound allegiance to her father, Kaidu Khan, the sovereign of the Chagatai Khanate. Kaidu was an astute and resolute leader, a kinsman and ardent adversary of Kublai Khan, the formidable emperor of the Yuan dynasty in China. Their contention was more than a personal matter. It represented a struggle over the destiny of the Mongol Empire itself. Kublai adopted the customs of Chinese imperial governance, whereas Kaidu adhered to the conventional nomadic traditions of Genghis Khan. In this high-stakes contest for power, Kutulun was more than just a daughter. She was Kaidu's most reliable subordinate. She went with him on military campaigns against Kublai's armies and other Mongol groups that tried to contest his authority. On the battlefield, she was frequently by his side, serving not only as a combatant but also as a consultant. Her strategic advice was valued as highly as her physical prowess. Her political influence was not limited to warfare. Within the Mongol framework, alliances were often solidified through marriage, and Kaidu's adversaries no doubt viewed Kutulun as a potential asset for negotiation. However, her matrimonial challenge, defeat her in wrestling or gain nothing, served as both a political safeguard and a personal decision. By remaining single, she prevented her father's enemies from gaining any advantage they might have secured through her marriage. This act of defiance was not overlooked. Historical records indicate that Kutulun's sway in the court was substantial enough to provoke jealousy and distrust from other nobles. Some charged her with exceeding her authority, while others claimed she had an improper influence over her father's choices. But Kaidu never seemed to question her loyalty or her abilities. To him, Kutulun was a vital component of his effort to maintain the autonomy and customs of their branch of the Mongol Empire. Her intimate connection with her father also meant that she bore his political responsibilities. When Kaidu's conflicts extended, causing strain on the Khanate's resources and alliances, Kutulun was present to broker ceasefires, mobilize soldiers, and keep uncertain allies in line. Her presence served as a reminder to all that Kaidu's leadership was supported by more than just his lineage. It was defended by a warrior who represented the very essence of the steppe. In those times, Kutulun's persona became inextricably linked with her father's cause. She was not only his guardian and champion, but also his spiritual successor, the tangible evidence that the ancient Mongol traditions were still vibrant and unconquered. In 1301, Kutulun's existence underwent a permanent change. Her father, Kaidu Khan, the resolute leader who had battled for decades to maintain the independence of the Mongol Empire's core territories from Kublai Khan's sway, passed away after years of conflict and political maneuvering. His death created a perilous power void in the Chagatai Khanate, and with it, the question arose: who would take the lead? Kaidu had reportedly thought of Kutulun as a potential successor. She had been his most dependable military leader, his closest advisor, and the child who most deeply grasped his vision for upholding the traditions of Genghis Khan's nomadic empire. However, Mongol politics, despite its practical approach in many respects, was still largely controlled by male leadership. For Kutulun to take power would have demanded more than just ability and devotion. It would have necessitated overcoming established rivalries and the aspirations of male relatives who considered themselves the rightful successors. The crisis of succession soon became acrimonious. Several of Kaidu's sons and male supporters vied for control, creating and dissolving temporary alliances with equal speed. Kutulun, although highly regarded, was subjected to whispered allegations that her wrestling career and her unmarried state rendered her unfit to govern. Some perceived her autonomy as a positive attribute. Others saw it as a danger to the political marriages and alliances that maintained the unity of the Khanate. Even without the formal title of Khan, Kutulun continued to be a powerful figure. She had her own group of devoted warriors and possessed considerable wealth. Her thousands of horses were a symbol not only of her individual success, but also of her capacity to compensate her allies. She engaged in the risky game of steppe politics, lending her support to and opposing contenders as it served her interests, always safeguarding her father's legacy and the stability of the Khanate. Yet the very traits that had made her a legend also rendered her a target. Adversaries circulated rumors, with some asserting she was overly domineering and others accusing her of overstepping her bounds by wielding authority equivalent to that of men. In this climate, trust was a scarce commodity and betrayal was an ever-present danger. Kutulun's ambition of leading in her father's place ultimately waned in the face of political realities. A male relative, Dua Khan, rose to prominence, consolidating his power. Nevertheless, Kutulun held on to her autonomy and her influence, continuing to shape the politics of the Khanate from the background, never surrendering the independence that had been the hallmark of her life. In the period following her father's demise, Kutulun continued to be a prominent figure on the Mongol steppe, one that could not be disregarded. Although she did not officially assume the title of Khan, her riches, military prowess, and dedicated followers guaranteed that she still held significant authority. She participated in military campaigns when it was required, resolved conflicts among her allies, and preserved a level of autonomy that was uncommon for any Mongol noble, particularly a woman. Her extensive herds of horses remained a tangible representation of her unbeaten wrestling career, providing her with both financial influence and the means to sustain warriors during times of strife. Even the Khan who then governed the Chagatai Khanate was cautious in his dealings with her. She was not a conventional princess to be dictated to. Yet with power came the burden of rumors. Some asserted that she had eventually wed, perhaps for political motives, although no such union was ever documented in historical records. Others whispered more sinister tales concocted by her adversaries, accusing her of having clandestine affairs or even conspiring against her own family. None of these allegations were ever substantiated, but on the steppe, gossip could be as lethal as a blade. Her final years were characterized by fluctuating alliances within a chaotic political environment. The once great unity of the Mongol Empire had long since broken apart, and the Chagatai Khanate was confronted with both internal disputes and external dangers. Kutulun, ever the strategist, navigated this complex game with care, using her influence where it would safeguard her position and protect her people. The details of her death, around 1306, are veiled in uncertainty. Some records state that she succumbed to an illness. Others suggest she was assassinated, implying that her independent nature had finally made her too great a threat for the men in power. The Venetian explorer Marco Polo, who had learned of her achievements during his time in the Mongol territories, provided no account of her passing, only of her remarkable life. Regardless of the actual events, Kutulun's legacy did not diminish. She lived on in the collective memory of her people as the undefeated wrestler, the intrepid warrior, and the woman who could not be compelled into submission, whether in matters of marriage, politics, or combat. Centuries later, her story would serve as inspiration for characters in art and literature. Her spirit continues to ride eternally under the endless blue sky she had dedicated her life to serving. Centuries after her passing, Kutulun's name continues to resonate on the winds of the steppe. In Mongolia, Central Asia, and further afield, she is remembered as a person who challenged norms, living life on her own conditions in an era where authority was typically gauged by the physical power of men and the alliances they created. She demonstrated that a woman could elicit both dread and admiration, not as an exception, but through her sheer skill. Her legacy as an unbeaten wrestler became the main focus of her narrative. Not a single man managed to defeat her in the ring, and her bet, 100 horses for each loss, made her one of the most affluent and respected figures of her time. This achievement alone set her apart from the other descendants of Genghis Khan, combining athletic supremacy with political astuteness. In the oral traditions of the Mongols, Kutulun is remembered alongside the most distinguished warriors of her time. She is praised for her devotion to her father, her proficiency in combat, and her refusal to be treated as a mere pawn in the game of political marriages. Folk songs and stories have portrayed her as the ideal of the powerful, independent Mongol woman, one who represented both grace and strength. Her tale also extended far beyond the steppe. The accounts of Marco Polo brought her fame to Europe, where her persona became intertwined with legend and folklore. In time, her life served as the inspiration for works of fiction and even opera. The most well-known instance is the character of Tandor in the plays and operas of later eras, most notably in Puccini's opera. Although these works heavily romanticized her story, transforming her wrestling challenge into riddles and her step background into an exoticized fantasy. Contemporary historians have endeavored to distinguish the facts from the romantic embellishments. Yet even the most conservative accounts depict her as an extraordinary individual. In a period when many women in positions of power were limited to the sphere of court politics, Cutulun commanded warriors in battle, set the conditions for her own marital prospects, and amassed great wealth, all the while staying steadfastly true to the customs of her people. Today, Cutulun's story is taught as both a historical account and a source of motivation. She serves as evidence that the Mongol Empire, despite its male-centric leadership, provided opportunities for exceptional women to ascend through strength, astuteness, and bravery. Her life was a testament that has echoed through the centuries. Strength is not defined by gender, and liberty is more valuable than any royal title.